Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's August 20th, 2026. We are going to launch into our main topic in a moment, but before we do that, I want to make a quick note about the recording we did last week, where I looked at the General Social Survey and some questions about life and death, and looked at responses by theistic orientation, that is, by those who believe in God, certainly those who were unfirm believers, looked at agnostics and looked at atheists. I neglected, though, to mention that analysis was restricted to non-Hispanic whites to get rid of racial confounding. And that's an important point to make, because without controlling for race, there will be some racial confounding that confuses the answers. But I did control for race, just forgot to mention it. And another brief subject I want to talk about, we hit a landmark in the history of the United States, in the American Empire, crossing the $40 trillion national debt threshold today. It took the United States over 200 years to accumulate the first $1 trillion in debt. And then it took the United States just over 3 months, 95 days, to accumulate the last $1 trillion in debt that put us at that nominal $40 trillion in debt mark. And I could go on and on about how this signals impending doom, the destruction of the U.S. dollar and the end of American global economic and military hegemony, alongside so many other perma-bears out there who are always talking about how the sky is falling. The sky was falling when we hit $10 trillion in debt, and then $20 trillion, and then $30 trillion, and now $40 trillion. And fair enough, the glib response to that would be it doesn't happen until it does, and then it did happen. But I'm going to offer an analogy that might help ground this a little more in the minds of skeptics. Imagine instead of debt as measured in dollars, we're talking about weight as measured in pounds for a person who is fat and becoming increasingly morbidly obese. I think the analogy to keep in mind here is, imagine that the $20 trillion mark was a guy 6 foot tall hitting 250 pounds, and his doctor telling him about the organ stresses and heart issues and other health issues, joint pain, and these sorts of things that were going to come along associated with this increase in weight. And then the guy is able to live as he had been living just fine, and he puts on another 100 pounds. He gets up to 350 pounds, and that's $30 trillion in debt, and still he seems to be kicking along. He's not dying. His heart hasn't exploded. He hasn't had a stroke yet. And so then he gets up to 450 pounds, and he's still putting on the weight, and he is, as his doctor is frantically telling him he needs to change course or he's going to have a heart attack and everything's going to come crashing down, he ignores it and he just keeps eating. And I think we are at that 450 pound mark, and we're continuing to shovel food down our gullets. And so I think the increase in Treasury auction rates now, with the 30-year Treasury at over 5%. This is indicative of blood pressure going way up and breathing becoming short as the weight continues to pile on. These things didn't happen at 250 pounds or 350 pounds, but they're happening now at 450 pounds. And so to expand a little bit on the glib, it doesn't happen until it happens response, I think there are many pieces of strong evidence that we really are getting close to that point.
Main topic this week, Jason Arday. Ness and I have been discussing this case a lot. We have been a little reluctant to cover it, mainly because it has received so much coverage already. It is tailor-made for the right-wing media and media in general. It's a sensationalist story.
Yes, indeed. It's not just the right wing, as we'll discuss. The corporate media and the managerial state also have their own spin on this story and are trying to utilize the story to further their own ends, especially in light of, I think, the event that really put it over the top for us to go ahead and talk about it on air instead of just off air, and that is him killing himself or being found dead. I guess officially it hasn't been ruled a suicide.
Jason Arday was in 2023 appointed as the youngest black professor in the history of the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom in England. He was 37 years old when he was appointed, and he became a professor of sociology of education. And Cambridge explicitly framed the hiring as part of an effort to address the underrepresentation of black academics and then people from disadvantaged backgrounds more generally. And at the time that he was appointed 3 years ago, there were about 150 black professors in the entire UK out of roughly 23,000 total professors. And Cambridge's diversity report in 2025 stated that 0.4% of its professors, or 5 people, were black. And it's not just because he's black that he attracted such a rabid attention. He had a unique personal story. He was raised in South London to a family from Ghana. He claimed that he had been diagnosed with autism as a child, and he didn't speak till he was 11. And then he overcame illiteracy as a teenager before eventually earning a PhD. And as we'll also see, step by step, there are lies and unbelievable circumstances every step of the way to that, from his childhood up to the point of him getting his PhD and being appointed a full professor at Cambridge. So this latest round, there were whispers and murmurs about Arday and criticism of some of his claims and criticisms of the rigor of his academic work. But from what I can tell, really came to a head last month when Nathan Coffness, who's an academic, he published a Substack post. The post detailed what Coffness claimed he did, which was run Arday's 2015 doctoral thesis, which he completed at Liverpool through plagiarism detection software. And Coffness found extensive passages that were near identical to a different student's 2009 dissertation. Long story short, the thesis and other of Arday's works are full of uncredited passages, and that is a cardinal sin in academia. I'm not near enough of a glutton for punishment to actually read Arday's thesis, so I use Claude. I uploaded the PDF, which is easily obtained online. I uploaded the PDF of the thesis to Claude, and I tried to just tell Claude to objectively analyze it, not to take in any context or bring in anything about Arday and all the media firestorm. And basically Claude said it was a unremarkable, sloppy academic paper that didn't do anything innovative, was basically just interviewing a bunch of people and the topic of mentoring of student teachers. So teachers who are aspiring teachers, they are often have superiors mentor them and give them advice. And that was kind of the standard paradigm. And Arday's thesis explored whether perhaps instead of getting mentorship from their superiors, from full teachers, their fellow student teachers could mentor each other. And Claude quickly picked up on many errors, basic grammatical errors, apostrophes in the wrong place, subject and verbs not matching, just very poorly written. That stood out to Claude a lot. And so I asked, if you were just judging off of this thesis in terms of the rigor of its academic scholarship, of the writing quality, would you expect this to belong to somebody who would be appointed a full professorship at a prestigious university such as, I mentioned, Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard or Yale? And Claude said very clearly, no, if we're judging just on this, you would not expect somebody like this to be appointed to a prestigious position. And so when Coffness published this Substack post last month, Cambridge's first reaction was to defend Arday. The university labeled the accusations a vile smear campaign designed to undermine Arday's credibility. That didn't last long, because after weeks of mounting evidence, and what the university described as new information, Cambridge announced that it would launch a formal investigation into Arday's academic record, and then that same day, Arday resigned. That was in early August of this year. He said that the personal cost had become too great to continue his post at Cambridge. And so in addition to the shoddiness of his academic work, there's whopper after whopper, obvious lie after obvious lie. I'm going to go through quite a few of them. Arday claimed to have raised £5 million. That's about $6.7 million for charity. Later, he clarified that was actually the collective total raised by a group of people. Some sources say up to 100 people over a period of 2 decades. He claimed to have run 600 miles in 6 days. In one telling, he said it was between Edinburgh and London. I don't know the UK well enough to say how far apart those places are, but it seems kind of unbelievable that you would even have enough space in the UK to run that many miles in such a short period. But he also claimed that he completed part of that 600-mile trek with a hairline fracture in his leg. And then in other accounts, he said it was actually 600 miles over 12 days with rest days included. And then apparently another time he claimed to have run 30 marathons in 35 days. And he suffered a fracture during the 21st of the 30 marathons.
There is an expression here that is relevant, that some people are so dumb so as to not know what they don't know. And that is, I think, what Jeff was getting at there, that this story about running hundreds of miles in the period of a week beggars belief. That it is difficult to imagine that someone would even propose having done something like that without having the self-awareness to recognize that it would be immediately pointed out as totally undoable, just would require a level of superhuman robotic it would require someone to be an automaton. And so it does provide some insight into the environment that someone like this is able to operate in. You imagine somebody telling you that yesterday they took a flight to the moon and came back, and they're standing right in front of you, and how do you react to it? And a lot of the fellow academics who would have come across these whoppers that he was offering would have to smile politely and nod along, and not, while they may think to themselves that this silly guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about, they wouldn't be able to express that in any way.
Arday also claimed to have held visiting professorship or visiting scholar positions at 2 institutions, including Ohio State University and the University of Glasgow's School of Education. Both institutions denied he had ever held those roles. Arday claimed to have published a book with the academic publisher Palgrave Macmillan titled Being Young, Black, and Male, Challenging the Dominant Discourse. The book never actually came out, and the project had been abandoned years earlier. Arday told interviews a story about a severed pig's head being delivered to his parents' home as an act of racist harassment. Police said they had no record of any such incident ever being reported. Arday told a journalist at Times Higher Education, who was investigating some of these claims, that he had documented the alleged harassment. And then The Guardian investigated other harassment claims and found they did not check out. And Arday's response was reportedly, quote, "To be honest with you, I thought you'd just believe me," end quote. And when journalists pursued the story, Arday did not simply deny the claims. He reported the Times Higher Education reporter Jack Grove to the Metropolitan Police for alleged harassment. The police investigated and closed the case without taking any action, but apparently this took about 4 months for the investigation to wrap up. And Arday also retained a prominent defamation law firm and threatened reporters with libel action. And there is a memoir that Arday had a book deal with Simon & Schuster to release. The memoir is titled Great and Unfortunate Things, and it actually just came out within the last week or two. And The Atlantic obtained both the original book proposal and the final published text, and there was significant differences between the proposal and the final book. The proposal included a claim that Arday had been hit by a car as a young man and spent months in a coma, with doctors advising his parents to consider taking him off life support before he miraculously woke up. That story did not make it into the final published book. The proposal included a story about a Brazilian, quote, shaman woman, end quote, who prophesies Arday's future suffering and success. But in the final book, she had been downgraded to, quote, a local aid worker who spoke some English. The Atlantic noted that by Arday's own account in the book, he was a scholar who could read only a single page of academic text per hour and could not comprehend what was happening at work 90% of the time, which raises some questions about how he was able to exist in a role that required a full professorship role at one of the most demanding universities, presumably in the world, Cambridge. As if all that weren't enough, Arday also wrote about having survived 2 brain tumors and testicular cancer. This guy is only in his early 40s when he died. He said that he also said he had been mugged by 4 teenage boys when he was a young man, and this assault had left him with epilepsy. Arday claimed that he later forgave 2 of the boys and that they became his students, and that Arday, became godfather to one of their children, and shockingly, journalists were unable to find contemporary reports corroborating any of this assault. And then at one point, Arday was questioned about his plagiarism, and Arday's explanation was that his autism caused him to rely heavily on what he called mimicry to process and understand written material, and that this explained the errors in his academic work.
Well, give him some credit for being innovative, because plagiarism is a kind of mimicry, you could say.
So that brings us to August 14th of this year, when Arday was found dead at an address in South London. He was 41 years old. The Metropolitan Police were called by ambulance services, and they claimed that there was no indication of foul play. Arday's family said in their own statement that he had been, quote, subjected to a campaign of sustained abuse, end quote, for the 3+ years since his appointment. The principal of Cambridge's Homerton College said Arday had told him days before his death that he felt, quote, hounded to death, end quote, and, quote, couldn't see a way out, end quote. In his resignation statement, which the Times of London at least described as either entirely or almost entirely AI-generated, Arday admitted no wrongdoing and rejected the narratives that had been built around him. It's interesting to imagine if large language models had been available at the time that Arday was producing his thesis. I wonder how much that would have affected it.
It would have made the plagiarism sussing out more difficult, because of course you can give AI commands to try to disguise the outputs to effectively plagiarize, but not word for word, not verbatim. I'm sure it'll turn into a sort of arms race where you'll have counter technology trying to suss out AI, trying to avoid AI in the process of trying to avoid being detected. But a lot of the plagiarism of the past is sitting there in plain sight, and having access to AI will make that more difficult to suss out in the future. And when we say this plagiarism is hiding in plain sight, this Christopher Rufo helped take out the president of Harvard, who did the same sort of thing. She's a black woman by the name of Claudine Gay, who had plagiarism in her PhD thesis. Maybe it wasn't her PhD thesis. It may have been some of her academic work. But it is a safe bet to imagine that a lot of the professors and the academics who sit in positions, especially non-whites, who or likely were elevated through affirmative action, that sit in posts of prominence in these elite institutions, in departments that end in studies, that a lot of, if not an outright majority, have fraud in their academic record if people just take the time to look for it. A more prominent example than Arday, and certainly than Claudine Gay, is Michelle Obama, alleged wife of President Obama, whose master thesis in the title page spells thank you with a hyphen in between it. We will talk about how Arday created compound words like case study, where instead of separating those multiple times, he combined those into a single word as case study. Well, Michelle Obama does it with thank you, where it turns into a hyphenated word. And then I'm going to read just the first paragraph of her master's thesis to illustrate, one, the existence of a typo in the very first paragraph, and then also the bloated, turgid, unfocused nature of what passes as high academic work. Quote, "The purpose of this study is to examine various attitudes of Black Princeton alumni in their present state and as they are perceived by the alumni to have changed over time. This study tries to examine the following attitudes of alumni: the extent to which they are comfortable interacting with Black and with white individuals in various activities, the extent to which they are motivated to benefit the Black community in comparison to other entities such as themselves, their families, God, etc., the ideologies they hold with respects to race relations between the Black and white communities, and feelings they have toward the Black lower class, such as a feeling of obligation that they should help improve the lives of this particular group of Blacks." That opening paragraph, containing 128 words, is crammed into just 2 sentences, and that was a typo there. The ideologies they hold with respects to race relations. That's the first paragraph of her master's thesis. That's the first paragraph of the first page of a thesis that goes on for 98 pages like that. And so in some respects, it's understandable that people haven't historically found the plagiarism in this sort of output, because it is an almost inhumane thing to ask somebody to read through that and maintain focus for 98 pages of something like that. And that is par for the course in a lot of these types of departments that end in studies and elevate people who don't have the intellectual chops to contribute anything in a field that isn't rigorous in any way to begin with.
I remember looking when I was in college at some sort of online database. It was less sophisticated than it is now, but I remember seeing certain academic papers, and you could see the view count or the read count, and some of these things I was pulling up had like 2 or 3 or maybe 5 views at the most. So many of these papers are just being produced, and maybe a couple peer reviewers will look at it, and then basically it goes into oblivion and nobody ever sees it again.
Yeah, good point. The people who are reviewing it, the people who are generating that 4 or 10 views, whatever the case might be, they are probably, it is generous to say that they have read the thing. There's probably a skimming, getting a general idea of what it is, and then approving the person who submitted it for reasons that have nothing to do with the academic output potential of said people.
Now back to Arday. We're going to discuss the reactions, oversimplifying things, but starting with the general left-wing reaction and then going into the general right-wing reaction, and we'll give some of our own thoughts on each perspective. So starting with the left-wing perspective, which I think Ness would agree is best articulated, best expressed by none other than Ibram X. Kendi, prominent Black anti-racist academic scholar. So in this framing, Arday is first and foremost a victim of racist media coverage of an institution, Cambridge, that used him for its own reputational purposes and then threw him away, and ultimately of a campaign that killed him. And Ibram X. Kendi, as we mentioned, is the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And that was a book that got a lot of play and attention during 2020, 2021, during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. It was quickly the top of the canon in terms of what white liberals read to do the work and become an ally and leverage their own white privilege and to help people of color who were facing racism and violence at the hands of the police and among other forces. Kindy's framing is explicit. He describes Arday as having been, quote, lynched by the media. Basically, his argument is that to be a prominent black scholar who writes about race is to be a permanent target. And the attacks on such a scholar come from all sorts of directions. From racist propagandists who resent the spotlight being put on anti-black racism, from white centrist and progressive academics who resent a black colleague's status and pay, and also from other black scholars competing for the same limited recognition, and then from social media users who pile on because outrage performs well on algorithm. And in Kindy's telling, Cambridge announced its investigation not because it cared about the truth, but simply to protect its own reputation, and the mainstream media, which Kindy repeatedly calls, quote, white-owned, end quote, did not investigate the people attacking Arday and instead simply amplified their attacks.
How courageous, pointing it out as being white-owned.
Well, he saw what happened to Kanye West, so Kindy points out the comparatively few articles that were written about, for instance, Peter Mandelson, who was a member of parliament who served in multiple prime ministers' cabinets, including Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And a year or so ago, some of the Epstein files revealed that Mandelson, while he was in the top levels of the UK government, was in communication with Jeffrey Epstein. And so Kindy's point is that this story got less coverage than this Arday story. And then Kindy also points to this other white academic who was accused of plagiarism. And according to Kindy, that story got less attention as well.
Yes, it is definitely because the white-owned media is protecting the people who are connected to Jeffrey Epstein and international intelligence.
I'll just interject real quickly my perspective on this. I think as evidenced by the litany of absurd claims that Arday has made over the years, I think that's a much more prosaic and likely explanation of the amount of media coverage. If there's just some boring, dry, white academic who gets accused of plagiarism and then resigns, there's really not much of a news story. I mean, it's not just that Arday was accused of plagiarism. It's everything else surrounding the story as well. And Kindy ends with this provocative line saying that when a prominent black scholar dies under this kind of pressure, the pressure that Arday was under, the media calls the attacks accusations to wash their hands of the blood. And that, quote, your lynchers announce your death as if they had no role in your lynching, end quote.
That is more than just rhetorical flourish. It is worth noting that, at least as we record now, Arday's death has not officially been ruled a suicide, and I think that will be quite convenient for the corporate media and for academia, for the managerial states, to have that be shrouded in mystery so that they are able to plausibly spin a narrative in which Arday did not take the coward's way out and die by his own hand, but that instead the hate speech that was directed at him, the misinformation, the disinformation, the harassment, and the like, that is what actually killed him. Maybe it manifests as a heart attack or a stroke or an anxiety, a panic attack that escalated and caused him to die, but that he did not voluntarily take his own life. Instead, he was, as they will try to portray it, almost literally killed by the violent words that were directed at him, and that will be utilized to ratchet up further control of and suppression of free speech and the censorship regime that here in America we're under what I suspect will be a bit of a brief reprieve, but that I expect that will come back as strong, if not stronger, than it existed in the early 2020s.
And again, I chose Kindy because I think he's pretty representative of the left, broadly defined, reaction to Arday and specifically his death. So Cambridge's Chancellor Chris Smith said it was possible to believe in academic integrity while still calling out what he described as, quote, a racist feeding frenzy. Lord Woolley at the Trafalgar Square vigil held for Arday accused the press of a quote, public assassination, end quote, and a lynching. Diane Abbott, who is the longest-serving woman in the House of Commons, called Nathan Coffness a racist on the record. Coffness, again, as we mentioned earlier, was the academic who first really brought to mainstream attention the fabrications of Arday.
Jeff reports that she called him a racist on the record. I suspect that if it hasn't already happened, at some point it will happen, that someone of some level of prominence on the left will directly accuse Coffness of killing Arday.
Professor Hannah Kienzler wrote that Arday, quote, was killed by a lynch mob whose harassment drove him to death, end quote. She also argued he was made killable, end quote, by an institution that exploited him to paper over its own structural racism, then failed its duty of care when the pressure came. Labor MP Zara Sultana offered a softer version of the same underlying claim, that a white middle-class academic in Arday's position would not have been hounded by the British press in the way that Arday was. Now moving on to the right-wing view of the Arday situation, staying within the Overton window. This view can basically be summed up by there being a demand for Black academics that vastly outstrips the supply of qualified Black academics. And so inevitably, people like Jason Arday are going to be elevated way beyond what their academic credentials and ability would predict. And that is why a review of 10 papers that Arday himself listed as his best work reveals that there's essentially nothing resembling real scholarship if you strip away all of the plagiarized material. There's little familiarity with basic statistics, and that it's mostly just Arday recounting his own experiences of alleged racism or reporting conversations with subjective commentary attached. So the critique talks also about credentialism and institutional rot, that Arday is a symptom of a rotten system, that Cambridge elevated Arday to a full professorship at 37 because it wanted a diversity showcase, not because his work justified it, and that there are thousands of more qualified academics who are disproportionately white and male who will never get the opportunity. The right-wing critique is also contemptuous of the academics who defended Arday. There's also a critique regarding press freedom and the danger of letting the threat or the reality of suicide become a tool to suppress reporting. So, as Ness mentioned, potentially this could be used as an excuse to crack down on free speech and specifically reporting, where reporters are discouraged or not even allowed to investigate charlatans, obvious charlatans like Arday, because by doing so, it could cause harm to the subjects of those investigations.
Yes, words are violence, as the Antifa expression goes. Jeff mentioned Professor Hannah Kienzler. It is worth noting, too, on her X account that she has a Palestinian flag next to her name. What she wrote was, quote, in full, what she wrote was, Jason Arday was killed by a lynch mob whose harassment drove him to death. He was made killable by an institution that exploited him to fix its structural racism, then failed its duty of care. Justice must be served and those responsible held accountable, unquote. And what she means by that held accountable, it might seem a little bit nebulous, but I think it is more sinister than anything, as I was getting on about previously, how the stage is being set to be able to look at Arday's death as homicide effectively, and the people who need to be accountable would be people like Nathan Coffness. An article from the BBC published today, Nathan Coffness, aforementioned, quote, said he was under investigation by Ghent University for discriminating against Arday. The university said a staff member had been notified of a preliminary disciplinary investigation and suspended him as a precaution. In a statement regarding Arday's death, its rector, Petra de Sutter, and vice rector, Herwig Reinhardt, said they took recent public statements made by a postdoctoral researcher at Ghent University, they're talking about Coffness here, regarding this matter very seriously and had taken appropriate action. They said the university stood for respect for human dignity and it opposes discrimination, hatred, and racism. And so when Professor Kanzler is talking about holding people accountable, well, that's what the administration at the University of Ghent is doing right now with Nathan Coffness. And when it all finishes up, he may be lucky to only suffer academic consequences as opposed to outright criminal ones. I don't think that is totally outside the realm of possibility. Parenthetically, I mentioned Kanzler's Palestinian flag next to her name. It is worth mentioning here that for those on the dissident rights who oppose Israel and America's support for it, of which I would count myself member, it is worth always keeping top of mind that these people, like Kinzler, they do not oppose Israel for the reasons that you do. They oppose Israel because they think Israel is a proxy of you, that you are no different from the Israelis as European-descended people living in white countries or formerly white countries today. Arday is, or was, an utterly mediocre intellect, but was a relentlessly pathological liar. These lies are exactly what Globo Homo wants, and so somebody like Arday or Ibram X. Kendi, they get vaulted into highly prestigious positions like the full professorship at Cambridge, one of the highest heights in the managerial state. And even though his role is largely symbolic, he is the pinnacle symbol as a black immigrant or second generation son of black immigrants from Ghana. Arday and people like him are lavishly funded in their managerial state positions by heritage European tax dollars. These Middle Europeans pay for the privilege of underwriting his anti-white agitprop. That anti-white agitprop is a mix of fabrications and plagiarism. His fraud is nearly ubiquitous. Every piece of so-called work he produces has been found to be, upon examination, it seems like hardly hyperbolic to say, an exclusive mix of fabrications, plagiarism, and self-indulgent personal anecdotes. Most, maybe all of which are some combination of obvious blatant lie, running 30 marathons in 12 days or whatever the absurd claim was, or grand embellishment, claiming that he'd raised millions of dollars for charity while being in his 20s, when in reality he was part of a large group of people who did so over several years or decades. Finally, his blatant fraud that's been hiding in plain sight gets exposed. His total intellectual bankruptcy receives a little scrutiny and he kills himself, or at least that's what I'm asserting, though as mentioned previously, I don't know that that will ever be dispositively asserted because it is probably more convenient for the Globo Homo narrative to be able to insinuate that he was killed rather than that he killed himself. When that happens, all the great and good immediately fall all over themselves to assert that he's a victim of a modern-day lynching. No matter what happens, Globo Homo's conclusion is always that white people are bad and white people are to blame. The existence of Ardays are great for women like Keitzler. She kicks the ladder out from lower status heritage whites who don't play the status game as well as she does, and her output, as a consequence, looks artificially better than it otherwise would because she is, I'm assuming here, probably more merited in her position than the Ardays of the world are. Sure, there are Anons on X who are more perspicacious and intellectually innovative than she is, but they don't get a hearing. She's more insightful than Arday, at least. That's a low bar to get over, but she is, and so to the people who matter and the institutions that broadcast their output, hers comes out on top. Jeff mentioned previously that one of the reasons we were reluctant to cover this is that so many other people are. It's such a hot topic in the pundit class now, and when affirmative action situations like this arise, the boomercon take will often be that merited non-whites suffer from the elevation of undeserving people like Arday. Because these people who aren't merited get elevated, it undercut the trust that people have in non-whites who are in positions of authority who legitimately deserve to be there. If you go for open heart surgery or to board a transatlantic flight, you want Dr. Goldstein, not Dr. Washington, to be operating on you. And you want your pilot to be a white guy in his 50s with bomber glasses and a mustache, not someone who looks like Chris Rock in his heyday. That sort of assumption, those assumptions are unfair to the Ben Carsons and the Clarence Thomases and Thomas Sowells of the world. And that's true as far as it goes, but it pales in comparison to the far more severe injustice suffered by all merited whites who get passed over for the undeserving non-whites who get elevated to positions of prominence and prestige like Arday. The students who get subjected to the Arday's tripe and the collective mass of heritage Europeans who fund all of it are far more severe victims than the Ben Carsons or the Thomas Sowells of the world could ever be. And we could care more for the Ben Carsons of the world if they'd get hot over these sorts of incidents, but they usually don't. Moving now to the words of a British MP, name of Zara Soltani, quote, "If Jason Arday were a white middle-class academic, he would not have been hounded by the British press in the way he was. My thoughts are with his loved ones. May he rest in peace," unquote. If Arday were a middle-class white European, no one would know who he is because he wouldn't be in the position that Arday was. Arday didn't have the chops to be at Cambridge unless the chops required are audacious, shameless, anti-white agitation. This very, very British MP, name of, remember, Zara Soltani, is the other side of the Kitzler support for Arday. She's not the relatively merited white who gets to morally preen and look good by comparison. She's another Arday. Her solidarity is important. There's a lot of ruin in a nation, and there are a lot of spots for a lot more Ardays. She can actually elevate her own pet victimhood status while conveniently having a higher status like Arday, because African men do top subcontinental women in the oppression pyramid. She can have him knocked off, or well, she didn't have him knocked off, but he was knocked off. These non-whites are the most privileged. The Soltanis and the Ardays are the most privileged minorities who have, it's probably not hyperbolic to say, have ever existed in the history of the world. And they use that privilege to trash the heritage populations of the societies they are privileged in. The more they're given, the less appreciative they are of what they are given, and the more spite they exhibit. Speaking of solidarity, no one has greater solidarity with Arday than Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote, quote, "The death of Jason Arday hit so close to home that I had no words yesterday, but I woke up with words. To be a prominent anti-racist black scholar is to know you are a target, almost totally surrounded by resentments. You know that at any point the attacks can come like a lynch mob. And if you die from all the attacks, the media still calls the attacks on you accusations to wash their hands of the blood. Your lynchers announce your death as if they had no role in your lynching," unquote. Ibram X. Kendi, and that's his fake adopted African name, not his given name. It's like Malcolm X or Muhammad Ali. He takes the self-absorption up a notch over the roundhead, Zara Soltani, by managing to make Arday's self-immolation about himself. That is, Arday's death, Kendi was able to make about Kendi. It's like a vampire trying to drain some of the status from Arday's corpse and take it for himself. There's so much projection there. Again, quote, "To be a prominent anti-racist black scholar is to know you are a target, almost totally surrounded by resentments. You know that at any point the attacks can come like a lynch mob. And if you die from all the attacks, the media still calls the attacks on you accusations to wash their hands of the blood. Your lynchers announce your death as if they had no role in your lynching," unquote. To be a prominent anti-racist black scholar is to know you're held aloft by your identity exclusively. The world pretends you have the chops for the sinecure you occupy, but if you have anything on the ball and an ounce of self-reflection, you know it's all bullshit, and so you despite all you have, and really not despite what you have, but because of all you have, you resent those beneath you more than anything else in the world. You resent it so much, you want the objects of your resentment to die. And if they dare push back, you feel as though you're under existential attack because the only thing greater than your resentment is your intellectual fragility. Kendi, like Arday, is a total fraud. All the non-whites and the subjects ending in hyphen studies are, but they have power, they have privilege, they have celebrity, they have resources, and they spend all of that to spit on and then strangle the golden goose that makes it all possible for them. The goose needs to grow some talons and use them. It can be kind of disheartening and depressing to focus on the responses from people like Kendi and Kensler and Soltani in response to Arday's death. But there is a white pill here that I see, and it's related to that intellectual fragility. Individually, these people, like Arday, like Kendi, are incredibly fragile. Like the black bloc on the street, they're only effective in groups. That manifests as warm bodies in person and institutional support in the virtual world. If you've been in this dissident world a while, you've seen people destroyed not for fabrications or plagiarism, but for making novel contributions to human understanding of the world. And the people destroyed don't merely lose the position they were making those novel contributions in. They never had such positions to begin with. They were doing it for free while holding down productive real lives and real jobs. Their consequences for toiling often in obscurity for free was to lose their unrelated sources of income and meaning, things that had nothing to do with their contributions. The Ardays of the world, in contrast, at worst just lose their prestigious sinecures and have to downgrade to less prestigious sinecures. Ibram X. Kendi got canned from Boston University, where he did nothing but collect honors and hate white people, and suffered the grave misfortune of having to move to the historically black college Howard for a sinecure where he does nothing but collect honors and hate white people. Meanwhile, dissidents lose everything for doing yeoman's work for free. Consider the people at Charlottesville or the J6ers who went through hell for exercising their constitutional rights and have, against the odds, many have anyway, not all, many, there have been tragic stories among those people who suffered the consequences of having attended Charlottesville in 2017 or the Stop the Steal rally in 2021. But many of them have managed to cobble together lives through all the negative attention, harassment, and often jail time they received. Even though they are often forever unemployable anywhere that is interested in a LinkedIn page. And you compare them and their fates to someone like Arday, who was rewarded far, far beyond anything he ever deserved. And when the rate of accumulation of honors, influence, and money simply came under threat for the first time in his life, his response was to kill himself. That is fragility that is remarkable. Black fragility that is remarkable. Not the fake white fragility hustlers like Robin DiAngelo peddle, but actual real world fragility where the smallest amount of pressure that most middle American white people, most middle class people of European descent wouldn't even notice is enough to crush people like Arday and Kendi. And so if the institutional structure is ever able to be changed, to be diverted away from the values and virtues such as they are that Globo Homo celebrates to something saner, then the resistance that, the institutional resistance that these kind of people will be able to offer can conceivably melt away pretty quickly. The last thing I want to raise is the question of why Arday's claims, his assertions of running around the world multiple times and surviving multiple cancers and being a mute that then became the youngest black professor in Cambridge history, being mugged by thugs who caused him permanent brain damage, caused seizures, and then magnanimously not only forgiving them, but being the godchildren of their parents, why he offered this string of whoppers. Why did he do that? And it's in large part because this identity is what he was trading in. As the son of black immigrants, He was born at the top of the oppression pyramid, and though we've trashed him here for doing nothing of merit from our perspective, he was obviously quite good at something that matters in that world that he excelled in. He was good at elevating his position even higher atop the pyramid by adding fake neurodivergence and health issues, pretending to have done incredible physical and philanthropic feats, all the while suffering debilitating setbacks both mentally and physically. And the system rewards that sort of identity building beyond just the relative basics of gender and immigrant status and race, to include other things like neuroatypicality or differential ableism or whatever the latest terminology is, to further separate oneself out from the rest of the victim classes.
It's not hard to understand why this story has attracted such attention. There are so many different layers to it. Maybe most obviously is the rot of the DEI framework and how it destroys meritocracy and standards and subordinates academic rigor to the religion of diversity. It shows the rot in the higher education world, and it's got absurd, salacious details in the form of Jason Arday and his many whoppers that we've discussed at length. If a white nationalist were writing a satirical movie script, the character of Jason Arday would have to have been toned down because it was just too over the top. But sometimes reality really is stranger than fiction.
Freedom, equality, or diversity. Choose one. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.